You had something to hide. Should have hidden it, shouldn't you?
All right, Reza, you have escaped from Arkansas. You have reappeared where?
Yes, I am in Boston right now.
Okay, so in Boston, we're going to talk about something that's kind of interesting to me and interesting to you, but for different reasons, because the subject is propaganda. And
Yes.
I used to work in that business, and you are fascinated by that business. So why don't you lead off?
Yes, I'm very fascinated by this subject. All right, well, let me start with the quote. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Now, that quote was by Edward Bernays in Propaganda. And today we're going to explore exactly what he meant. Now, Robert, not a lot of people know, but you got your start in marketing. So I guess if you're a marketer, you have to you got to kind of become a specialist on this subject. Can you give us a little bit of background or a story to kind of introduce?
When I was a kid in high school, they had aptitude and interest tests, and you would be sort of asked what you liked and then what you were good at, and then they would sort of match them up together. And I took these tests, and it showed that I had some serious deficiencies in some areas, like math, and some serious talents in others. So they came up with this list, and the list included astronaut, adventurer, and advertising man. Now, you can imagine in Canada, the idea of being an astronaut doesn't sound too promising, and being an adventurer was sort of something that I had no idea what that was. So I, at some point, I lived in a car, I picked fruit, blah, 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 tiny violin. But essentially, I ended up in Toronto with a high school degree and the sense of like, okay, I'm going to be an advertising man. So I literally asked for the president of every ad agency in Toronto, starting with A, going all the way through to Z, or Z in Canada. And I would ask to speak to the president. And, most people would sort of laugh at me. But I got through, and I met with 3 of the presidents. And I said, look, I'm supposed to be an advertising guy, but I have no idea what an advertising guy does. And so they explained. And to make a long story short, I ended up working in the mailroom, and I ended up working on campaigns. And then I got into a place called Batten Barton, Durstine, and Osborne, BBDO. And I was a copywriter at age 17. And self-taught, right? So, everything's new to me. I got to study. I read all the books by David Ogilvy. I was, trying to figure out how to be a good advertising writer. Now, a writer is a little different than the researchers and people that put together the campaigns. I would simply go out and ask people in supermarkets or car dealerships or whatever what they thought of this product, and I would listen to them. Mm-hmm. And I would always be impressed with how innately intelligent people were when you asked them about products and why they made certain purchase decisions, why they ate certain foods, which is fine. But my job was actually to sell them something they didn't need, whether it's a new car or whether it's a certain form of, I hate to say the word junk food, but something that isn't just a basic staple. So I wrote, and while I was there, we had this guy who, I think he wrote a book later, and he kept sending us letters of our ads saying there's some kind of secret imagery buried in there, right? And so he would send us a picture of a glass with ice cubes, and he'd say, see the skulls in there? And then there's naked women in there. And we're like, wow, okay, well, it wasn't ordered by us. It was our client, right? We did the shoot. And he would keep insisting that we were burying and hiding things inside the message. And I said, no, it says right there in the headline, have more fun when you buy Bacardi. We don't need to put skulls in there.
Right.
So he became quite famous for this idea that there was a secret group of people burying images and messages inside advertising.
So he's talking about subliminal imagery. Was he a bit of a schizo, or was he really seeing something? Was that really there, or was it not really there? Did you guys end up seeing something?
I was handed these letters, to like deal with them, because it was almost so laughable. Because remember, you're in advertising, you do a lot of planning, you do a lot of research, and if you're doing a Bacardi ad, you're going to hire one of the best photographers. He's going to use glass ice cubes. He's going to use lighting. There's like everybody there. There's no sort of secret window or room where it goes into and it turns into something secret. But these people were seeing things in there, and I thought, okay, I don't want to call him a wacko, because okay, you see a picture of a motorcycle and then there's a young girl draped over the motorcycle. Now, obviously, the subliminal message is that if you have this motorcycle, you will get laid, right? But it's like, we don't have to hide skulls or, inside.
Yes.
But it always made me think that people saw things in things that didn't actually exist, and it scared them.
Okay. So it was advertising. It was almost like it was working not on the rational mind, but he was seeing something. He was feeling something more on an emotional level.
Yeah, and so let's get into the basic origins of what we would call propaganda. The basic elements of warfare and leadership throughout history have always relied on imagery and actions, right? And when they talk about a mountain of skulls, right? Genghis Khan and a mountain of skulls, or Tamerlane would go into a village, chop everybody's heads off and stack them up. Well, he didn't do that to every village because he needed those people. But that message would then say to other people, like, do you want to have your head chopped off, or do you want to work with us and, be a serf? When I was in the war in Afghanistan, I used to move around with General Dostum, go into these Taliban villages, and he would ring the village with rockets and shells and troops, and he would just stroll in, and he would walk in, and he'd say, well, what do you want? You want us to flatten the village, or do you want to come over to our side and we'll pay you money? So, I mean, this is marketing, historical marketing. But the place where it really started was a place called psychoanalysis, with Sigmund Freud at the turn of the late 1800s, when he was a doctor, and he had noticed that one of his cohorts had treated a female patient with hysteria by talking through her fears. And this woman had physical manifestations, she had neurological manifestations. And he wrote a book, very famous book, on psychoanalysis. And this was predicated on the idea that you, if you had a problem, would go to a doctor, you'd close the door, you'd lay back on the couch, and you would tell him your darkest fears. And he would listen and write these things down, and he would have you talk you through it. This is called psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. His nephew, the quote you read about secret men manipulating what we want, how we think, whatever. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a medical doctor, but he was instrumental in applying his uncle's ideas to the manipulation of people. And that is that we have a secret part of us, like what we present in real life is actually a very shallow part of what our emotionals and our background really is. And so we had the deep, dark things that drove us to do things. So
you're talking about Edward Bernays, and he's
so Edward Bernays. And Bernays began in World War I working for President Wilson on this committee to convince Americans that it was good that we were in the war killing Germans. And, back then America was a predominantly German immigrant population, so he had a tough job. But he had to convince people, first of all, that the Germans were doing a bad thing, and then it sort of turned into a hate fest, because that was the most productive way to generate responses, that we began to hate the Germans, and therefore our participation in the war was productive. So right. What you see is the difference between psychoanalysis and psychometrics, the measuring of people's sort of different personality categories. Mm-hmm. And in advertising and marketing, you're saying, well, who would buy an expensive red sports car? It's obviously not the same person that would buy a gray, cheap Volkswagen. They're different people. They're different markets. We don't sit those people down and say, tell me your deepest fears, tell me your desires, your dreams, and write it all down. No, we calculate, we estimate what they will do based on certain sort of characteristics that they're grouped into. And we'll get into those 5 different groups. Mm-hmm. And then I think people began to realize that, okay, I think I'm being manipulated because I'm being told something that isn't factual. I'm not being told, eat this cereal because it has this much protein, this much sugar. I'm being told that if I eat this, I'll be happy. Mm-hmm. When I see Coca-Cola, I'm not drinking it because it's cheaper than orange juice. I'm looking at a group of people that are having fun and they're doing cool stuff, and I want to be like them, right? And they're appealing to things that have nothing to do with the actual product. So this is the origins of marketing and trying to sell things to people that may not realize that they're being sold to.
Is this what our democracy is really based off of us? You hear about American consumerism. Are we in, they've turned us into a bunch of consumerists. We're not a socialist nation, we're a consumerist nation.
The idea of choice. In Europe, you had the feudal system, and you had the boss, and then you had the serfs. The serfs didn't really have a choice. They had to work, give a percentage of their food or output to the prince and go fight his wars. And if they did that, they were allowed to be serfs on his property. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a whole lot of marketing back then. In America, you had people that made a conscious decision to leave Europe or wherever they came from, which had a very structured society. Many of these people were religious people that didn't get along with the leaders' view of religion, whether they be Puritans or, we would call them sects or cults. So they came to America where they felt they would have freedom. And in that freedom, they also had a lot of choices to make. So the American model was based on self-determination, that you as an individual can make decisions that will benefit you in the long term, and that you as a society made out of these units of self-determined people will create a society that'll be healthy and productive.
Right, and a lot of people find that dangerous, giving too much power to the individual. So tell us, how did Bernays in the 20s morph this into a science that can be used?
Okay, so in 1914, Bernays was working for the government. He was helping sell the idea that America should be over in Europe fighting World War I. He was successful at that. As a matter of fact, he was very impressed that with this incredible saturation of pamphlets, posters, radio broadcasts, and he used these things called 4-minute men, which were recruits and sort of social influencers. And back then it would be a priest or a business leader or something, and he would give a 4-minute speech at a public area or a church or whatever, and he would explain why America needs to fight a war in Europe. And he, the numbers are kind of fantastic. He hired 75,000 of these 4-minute men, and they did, in his words, they delivered over 7.5 million speeches, and they were able to reach 300 individuals. Now, some were repetitive because there are only 103 million people, but
300 million individuals.
Well, 300 million speeches, and there are only 100 million people in America at the time. So the point was that he was blown away by an orchestrated, focused campaign to shift perception, shift opinion. Yeah. So this became his bailiwick. Now, he was not an educated man. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't trying to sell a theory. He was trying to make money. He was basically a huckster. Right. So he then said to corporate America, if you put enough into a campaign, you can do things different than what advertising can do. Now, you remember, there's advertising, which is basically purchasing space in media with messages, whether they be ads or, posters or whatever. Right. And then there's PR, which is a very insidious form of advertising. And what that means is I go to the New York Times and I say, I've got this new invention. I want you to interview the inventor, and I want you to tell everybody how fabulous this is. And they will do that. Now, they won't say in the New York Times article that we were approached by a PR firm, right? Whether it's a country, whether it's a product or whatever. So PR is how you launch movies. It's how you launch products. It develops reputations. Like, you remember Stephen Jobs, who I worked with, he wanted to be sort of a futurist and a business leader. It was very important for him to do PR, be on the covers of magazine. these magazines are pitched, right? They don't get up in the morning like, let's make Steve Jobs famous.
I used to work for a magazine. I started interning in a magazine after college, and I realized that really everything was an advertorial, not really an editorial. You would look through a magazine, and everything was pretty much paid for, bought.
Yes, and this is one of my main critiques of media. Someone like me can take my own money, go to a foreign country, cover a war, come back with footage, and put it on TV, right? I can put it on the internet, whatever, and it's a reportage. It's media. Someone can pay for a journalist, put them on a plane, take them to a refugee camp, take them around saying, okay, interview this person, or you might want to talk to this person, talk to this expert here, do these canned pieces, which you see on TV all the time, and that is basically advertising for their activities. Now, what's the difference between me going into a war and talking to the rebels versus people being actually facilitated into covering conflicts? Well, NGOs have to constantly generate awareness of what they do so that they can get money for the next disaster. So they're constantly in the misery business. So when there is an earthquake or there is a war, they have funds from before to pay for the proceeds. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying, but it's not news per se. There's a process in there that you're not told about. Yeah. So is that insidious? Yes, it is, because we all see true crime stories about some, Bitcoin or Silicon Valley wunderkind who was suddenly elevated to this massive level of perception and praise, and we find out that what product she or he was selling was complete bullshit and that it was a scam, right? And we are angered by this, saying, well, why didn't they do their due diligence? Why didn't they ask tough questions? Or it's because it was PR. Mm-hmm. So Bernays, let's get back to Bernays, because one of the things he did, which I found so shocking, was the cigarette companies at that time were running amok, right? You remember the old ads, which seem funny now, but are kind of scary. Cigarettes were good for you. They had doctors smoking cigarettes saying, this is good for you, cleans out your lungs, or makes you feel relaxed, or whatever. They were trying to get women to smoke. And of course, women had been given the vote. And the idea was, well, how do we show that they're liberated, that they're free?
And the idea behind that is like they cornered the market on men, right? You only have so many men.
Oh, there was saturation. I mean, men had to smoke because it was tough. It was, man, could you see a movie actor without a cigarette in his mouth?
Well, they make more money, so now they need to sell to that other side of the population, right?
So he came up with the idea that we'll have these women lighting the cigarette off of the liberty torch or a torch of freedom, and that empowers them. Mm-hmm. Now, we know now that cigarettes kill you, and it's a bad thing, and nobody should do it, and it's just awful. But women went from not smoking to smoking, not in the same quantities, but this is an example of manipulation, of sort of a subtle use of an emotional hook to get you to do something that's bad for you. And I'm not saying Bernays was a bad guy, but what he was basically saying was, if you don't do this, we're talking about governments now and corporations, if you don't drive the narrative, then you don't exist, and other people will drive the narrative and you will disappear. And we learn this to be true, because what he's saying is, you take what you're trying to do, put it into a short, snappy slogan, use visuals and icons and very simple motifs, and go after specific kinds of people to sell your product using an emotional hook, not logic, right? Not you must do this because it's good for you. So this was where Bernays sort of shone, because he was really changing the way that corporate America looked at influencing people, and it became insidious.
Yes.
And we have this now in politics with lobbyists, with campaigns, with same people that run elections are not saying, here's two old white guys that are basically identical, pick which one you like because we don't care. No, they have to be crafted. They have to be branded. They have to have some kind of motivation that gets you out to vote for this guy instead of that guy.
It's morning again in America.
Then we will not
not fail.
Movement to take back our country. We will make America great again.
And you remember Nixon versus Kennedy. The choice was like the young, energetic guy or the kind of dark-looking guy. You know, sometimes the choices were much simpler.
But that
today,
was interesting. That was interesting that you brought that up, because that was the first time I think they ever had a debate on television. And that
right, but they had to brand these people, even though those people weren't necessarily on brand themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they had to say to them, "This is what you have to project to the American people."
Yeah.
These are the short, snappy. You know, funny enough, Nixon used law and order, which guess who? You know, this is the same slogan they use today.
Yeah,
because that was a secret.
I remember learning as a kid that was the first time they saw two people debate, and that's why Kennedy won, was because people just liked the way he looked better and the way that he presented physically better.
Correct. And this is an American phenomena where if someone is on television enough and they appear personable and witty, and we like them. I mean, they're part of our family. The television, you know, the radio used to be voices, and you had those beautiful voices talking to you through the darkness, and people would literally listen for hours to the radio and be soothed by it, until Orson Welles came up with a thing called War of the Worlds, which was a completely fictional radio play about aliens that had landed in New Jersey and were slowly taking over the world. And this was done in real time. So it's like from the time they landed to the world was destroyed was just a couple of hours. But people were freaking out because they were so connected to the messaging and the voice that they felt that this was actually happening. And on television, you know, people added imagery to it. So you had to have a face. So the radio guys that maybe looked like me suddenly were replaced by younger sort of, you know, the Dan Rathers of the world. And they would combine a beautiful voice with an attractive physique, with a physical manifestation of what we thought, you know, a reporter would look like. When we get into the internet, what we find is that it's not really about physical looks. It's about getting attention. The idea of constantly digging at people and constantly saying outrageous things and getting numbers, getting clicks, getting attention. So we've seen an evolution of what I would call PR, because each product has to exist in that marketplace. And again, PR shifts. In other words, the world of influence and propaganda shifts to exist in that world.
Yeah. So we have propaganda, PR, and psychological operations. It sounds like all three of these things are the same thing. I went to the Army website, and they have a page on psyops, on psychological operations, how to influence people. Okay, let's bring this into the context of the world's most dangerous places and specifically what you do. And from your experience in conflict zones, how early in a campaign do psychological operations begin compared to conventional military actions?
But there was one specific instance. It's called the Iraq War. I had been in Afghanistan, and everybody was a war correspondent then, and they were ramping up for Iraq. And there was a lot of concern, like, why are we going into Iraq? Well, they have weapons of mass destruction.
We're going to win this victory. Tragically, we will lose American lives, but it will be brief. We're going to find out massive evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to find the incredible brutalities that this dictator has inflicted upon the Iraqi people. And so I think he's going to be justified. I'm confident that he will be justified.
I am confident that all those things that you predict are going to come true, and a lot of people that have been laying out the case against us are going to be very embarrassed.
And I was in a bar in Washington in 2002, right? This is a year before they went in April, May. And this lady's having a few beers, and she's probably in her 30s. And I'm just talking about, there's a lot of talk about her. And she said, well, we're going in. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, I'm a pallet master. I'm the one that designed all the cargoes that has to go over. I said, we're going into Iraq. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, shit. So all this argument about whether they have weapons of mass destruction is irrelevant. The decision has already been made. The question is, how do you convince the public that it's real? And if you go back and you analyze, and it's been done many times in documentaries, whatever, you see the same techniques that Bernays used, but before the war.
Sorry to say, but certainly television, and perhaps to an extent my station, was intimidated by the administration and its foot soldiers at Fox News. And it did, in fact, put a climate of fear and self-censorship, in my view, in terms of the kind of broadcast work we did.
Talk about letting people know that ratings have gotten under your skin. Nothing could be further from the truth, obviously, and I'll let the news media defend themselves, but I promise you 5, 10, 15 years from now, people who study these things will say, you never saw such real, you never saw such accurate, you never saw such hard-hitting coverage of military conflicts.
A week later, CNN hired the Pentagon's media flack, Victoria Clark.
You know, he was brought in to convince people we should be in Europe after the war, but we're now telling people we need to have a war in Iraq with a guy that we used to support. You know, he used to fight Iran and we would send him weapons, and he used to use them against the Iranians. And now we have to reverse that, and then we have to now go after this guy. So they began to plant in the media. We're talking about the New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, the highest profile media, the supposedly the smartest, most cynical editors and writers, false stories about campaigns and evidence of weapons of mass destruction.
With encouragement from the Pentagon, the news networks fashioned their coverage to maximize production values, to make it exciting. Time magazine called the approach militainment. Journalist Robert Pelton describes how it was done.
I was in some of the initial phone meetings between New York and the people in the field. And this was being set up like a movie shoot. There was a channel called Best of the Bombs. And this is exactly what it was called, Best of the Bombs. And every piece of good footage from any network would be tossed onto this feed. This is a satellite feed. So if you're doing a story about, hi, I'm standing in the middle of nowhere, and let's roll to the footage, you would have this feed that had only good explosions. Secondly, they told people to take your camera off the sticks. We want to have that cinema verite look. You know, move it around, move it around. We want to see where you are. We want you to walk and talk and make people feel that you're in the middle of something.
This is true. A Defense Department memo urged military commanders to encourage action coverage. Quote, use of lipstick and helmet-mounted cameras on combat sorties is approved and encouraged to the greatest extent possible.
If you were to pick a generality, they were there for the big story. And keep in mind that Iraq is unusual because in the early days of CNN, one of the most memorable images were people like Peter Arnett sitting on a rooftop calling the war like a football game.
This is the 6th cruise missile to have come over our heads in the last half hour.
But the entire population of the planet focused on one journalist. So this was a wet dream for any journalist that went to Iraq, to be in that spot for a well-known predicted war to happen. If you're the guy holding that microphone and that thing happened behind you, that's what you're known for.
And there was also a story about Al-Qaeda being hidden up in Kurdistan, and we got to go over there too, and, you know, so on and so forth. So we are not immune from that. And I'll take you further. So 2019, there were some attacks on tankers in the Straits of Hormuz.
Navy confirms it's aware of a suspected torpedo attack on several oil tankers.
For some strange reason, John Bolton and other people sent a carrier fleet into that region because this was the old Dick Cheney thing about, you know, they're going to block the Straits of Hormuz and none of the oil will come out, which is fiction because they all need that strait to send their products out, including Iran. So then there was another one on cue. Another tanker gets damaged. And I'm not an expert on everything, but I do dive very, very deeply into things that I care about. And it was clear that there were 2 explosive devices put on the side of the hull about the height that you would walk up to on a dock, right? In other words, not below the waterline where you're supposed to put mines, but actually up on the side. And oil tankers are double-hulled vessels, which means that a mine here is not really going to affect the cargo that's inside there. It might explode the gas that's trapped between the 2 steel layers. But it was designed to create a primary event and a secondary event. So the primary, the first attacks were were ships that had actually been in the UAE, in Fujairah, under the control of the UAE. They weren't coming from Iran. There was nobody sailing around. Somebody had gone in and put small explosives on these 3 ships, damaged them. They had a very controlled sort of press thing where they took you around and they showed you things. I looked at that and I said, that's a tape charge, and it's above the water line, and it's right behind where the water tank is. There's no way that would have sunk that ship. So I knew instantly that this was fake. This was a false flag event. The second one was when the actual U.S. military was there, and a helicopter, Black Hawk, flew over. It took a long time for it to do it, started filming, and all they released was this grainy black and white footage of, smoke coming from this oil tanker. And they were able to capture the Iranian Coast Guard taking the mine off. Now, if you know anything about mines, Iranian mines are actually booby-trapped. And they're normally put where the propeller is, or they're put under the water, and they're designed to cripple or sink ships. There's nothing a mine 12 feet above the waterline is going to do to a ship other than make a big hole. So I then went deeper into this, and suddenly there's the most modern drone we had at the time, a Navy drone flying over the area. And this drone is unusual that it also has a 737 behind it with sensors and analysts. So that it flies, it gathers information, and there's a plane behind it. The Iranians shot down the drone. And they used an old SAM missile, surface to air. Now, this is a stealth drone, right? It's supposed to be the best we have. Freaked out the Pentagon and Trump, who said, "Cut, we're not launching a war with Iran." But this was, again, another attempt to lead us into a war in 2019. So I'm just saying that, okay, now Bernays would be chuckling at this because they had sped things up dramatically. Instead of like a long build-up to like, we got to get Iran, we got to get Iran. It was a series of short, traumatic things, which is more internet friendly, right? Like violence, something that happens that's surprising, travels much quicker on the internet than it does in print media. So again, we're not immune from this. And even today, if you were to say, okay, let's look at what our government is talking about and see where the impetus for these talking points come from, you see that a lot of it comes from foreign nations, from private donors, from corporations, some special interest groups, and they're being translated into emotional directives. So, so the more you understand about manipulation, and the more you understand about public relations, and the more you understand about advertising and how media affects you differently, the more you can be discerning about, hey, that's BS basically. What I saw, what I heard is not true, and I'm going to do my own digging on this, and you'll come back with much more intelligent results.
You had something to hide, should have hidden it, shouldn't you? And now you're not satisfied with what you're being put